The Forgotten Front, Japan's early ambitions and the road to total war. Before the jungles of Guadalcanal, before the island fortresses of Iwo Jima, and before the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, there was another war. One that began not in Europe, but in Asia. Long before most of the world realized it, Japan had already been at war, fighting battles that would shape the entire course of the Second World War. This is the story of forgotten battlefields, from the burning cities of China to the sweltering jungles of Burma and the lonely coral atolls of the Pacific. A war driven by ambition, empire, and the belief that destiny favored one nation's rise over all others. 1. The seeds of empire. In the 1930s, Japan stood at a crossroads. After rapid modernization following the Meiji Restoration, it had become a formidable power, industrialized, militarized, and hungry for resources. But for Japan's ruling elite, surrounded by Western colonial empires, Asia felt like a prison. They saw the European powers controlling trade routes, raw materials, and territory, and they believed Japan deserved the same. It began with Manchuria. 1931. A false flag explosion along the South Manchurian Railway. The Mukden incident gave Japan the excuse it needed. Within months, the imperial army had seized the region, setting up a puppet state, Manchukuo. To many Japanese, it looked like progress. To the world, it was the first warning sign of a coming storm. Archival quote: League of Nations Delegate 1933. This is not the act of a civilized nation defending its borders. It is aggression, plain and deliberate. Japan's response: they simply walked out of the League of Nations. The stage was set for a conflict that would consume Asia long before Hitler marched into Poland. 2. The war before the war. In 1937, Japanese troops clashed with Chinese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. It was supposed to be a minor skirmish. Instead, it ignited one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Cities fell one by one: Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai. Then came Nanjing, a name forever etched in horror. Between December 1937 and January 1938, Japanese soldiers massacred an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Eyewitnesses told of rivers clogged with bodies, of women and children slaughtered without mercy. Foreign journalists and missionaries recorded the nightmare in diaries that shocked the world. Diary of Minnie Vautrin, American missionary. Nanjing, 1937. They come every day. They beg us to hide them. I cannot save them all. God forgive us for surviving this. The world condemned Japan, but no one intervened. Western powers were preoccupied with Europe's looming crisis. And so, the fires in Asia burned on, unseen and unchecked. 3. The empire expands. By 1938, Japan had occupied much of eastern China, but the deeper it pushed inland, the more resistance it met. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek relocated his government to Chongqing, deep in the mountains, where Japanese bombers unleashed devastating raids. Thousands died as incendiary bombs flattened civilian districts. Hospitals, schools, even refugee shelters, nothing was spared. Still, China refused to surrender. Japan's leaders, frustrated by the war's stagnation, began to dream bigger, of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a vast empire stretching from India to the Pacific. Their message: Asia for Asians. Their method: total war. 4. Prelude to global conflict. As Japan's armies advanced across Asia, it began to look west toward British-controlled Burma and French Indochina, and south toward the resource-rich islands of the Pacific. But there was one problem: oil. Japan imported nearly all its petroleum from the United States. When Washington imposed an oil embargo in 1941, Japan's empire faced collapse within months. The choice was clear: yield or strike. On December 7, 1941, the world awoke to the roar of Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor. But for those in Asia, the war had already been raging for a decade. The global conflict had merely caught up. The forgotten battles of China had now become the prelude to a world war. In the next chapter, We followed Japan's armies as they marched through the jungles of Southeast Asia and into one of the most brutal and forgotten campaigns of the war, Burma. If you're captivated by the untold stories of we, don't miss Part 2 Jungle Inferno, the Burma Campaign and the Fall of Empire. Subscribe and join us as we journey deeper into the war's hidden front lines. Jungle Inferno, the Burma Campaign and the Fall of Empire in the thick jungles of Southeast Asia, where heat could kill as swiftly as a bullet, the Empire of Japan faced a new kind of enemy. Not only soldiers but the jungle itself. This was Burma, a campaign forgotten by many, yet one of the most grueling and decisive struggles of World War I. 1. The invasion of Burma, January 1942. Fresh from the victory at Singapore, Japanese forces swept westward, striking deep into British-held Burma. Their goal? To cut off the famous Burma Road, the lifeline through which the Allies supplied Chiang Kai-shek's China for the British Empire. Burma was a backwater defended by a patchwork of colonial troops, British regulars, Indian divisions, Chinese expeditionary forces, and a few thousand local volunteers. They were under-equipped, under-trained, and utterly unprepared for the speed of the Japanese advance. Archival quote British officer Rangoon, they came through the jungle as if the trees themselves were fighting for them. By March, the Japanese had taken Rangoon, the capital. Allied troops retreated north in chaos, slogging through mud and monsoon toward India. Thousands died of malaria, dysentery, exhaustion, and starvation long before meeting an enemy face to face. 2. The road to nowhere. The fall of Burma cut China off from Allied aid, a disaster for the war effort. To reopen that lifeline, the Allies began building a new route, the Ledo Road. Carved by hand through some of the harshest terrain on Earth, tens of thousands of American engineers, African-American labor battalions, and local Burmese and Indian workers sweated under deadly conditions, clearing mountains, building bridges, and battling disease. Diary of a U.S. Army engineer. 1943. You don't fight the Japanese here, you fight leeches, snakes, fever, and the earth itself. Every mile of this road costs lives. By the time it was finished, in 1945, the war was nearly over. The Ledo Road had become a monument not to strategy, but to endurance. 3. The Chindits and the Jungle War. In 1943, the British launched a daring experiment. A force of special units, led by the eccentric Major General Ord Wingate, would penetrate deep behind enemy lines. Their name, the Chindits, operating in small groups, supplied entirely by air. The Chindits sabotaged railways, ambushed convoys, and harassed Japanese columns living off the jungle for weeks at a time. They became legendary, but their suffering was immense. Letter from a Chindit soldier. The jungle is alive and it hates you. We sleep in mud, march till our feet rot, and fight men we cannot see. Death comes softly here. By the campaign's end, half of Wingate's men were dead, wounded, or too sick to continue. Yet their sacrifice bought the Allies time and drew vital Japanese forces away from India. 4. The Siege of Impel and Kohima. In 1944, the Japanese launched Operation U-Go, an ambitious invasion of India through the mountains of Manipur and Nagaland. Their target, the British supply hubs of Impel and Kohima. For months, brutal fighting raged in the hills and valleys as Allied defenders, British, Indian, and African troops fought under relentless artillery and monsoon-dotted Kohima. The battle was so close that opposing trenches were just yards apart. The tennis court of the deputy commissioner's bungalow became a killing ground. Eyewitness account. British officer. We fought over every inch. At night, we heard them whispering just beyond the sandbags. By morning, one side would be gone. When the monsoon broke, the Japanese supply lines collapsed. Starvation and disease decimated their ranks. The invasion failed, a catastrophic blow that marked the beginning of Japan's retreat in Southeast Asia. 5. Forgotten heroes. The Burma Campaign saw soldiers from across the world, British, Indian, Chinese, African, American, and Burmese, fight side by side in some of the most brutal conditions of the war. Yet, for decades, their story remained overshadowed by Europe and the Pacific. More than 100,000 troops died in Burma. Entire villages vanished under bombardment. For many veterans, their service was scarcely acknowledged. Excerpt Indian veteran. 1982 interview. They called us the Forgotten Army, but we remember every step, every friend we left behind in that green hell. 6. Turning of the tide. By 1945, the Allies had retaken Rangoon. Japan's empire in Southeast Asia was collapsing. Its armies shattered, its supply lines strangled. Burma was free again, but at a cost measured in suffering few could imagine. The jungles that had swallowed entire divisions would take decades to recover. For the people of Burma, independence was near, but the scars of war ran deep. As the jungle battles ended, the war moved once again across the vast ocean of the Pacific. There, on remote islands and coral reefs, Japan would fight its most desperate and savage battles of all. If the bravery and sacrifice of the Burma Campaign moved you, don't miss Part 3, Islands of Fire, Guadalcanal and the Pacific Inferno. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter in the Forgotten War. Islands of Fire, Guadalcanal and the Pacific Inferno. In the heart of the Pacific, where palm trees swayed over quiet lagoons, the calm hid a storm. For here on a speck of land few had ever heard of, the tide of war began to turn. This was Guadalcanal, a name that would become synonymous with courage, exhaustion, and the bitter struggle for survival. 1. The island nobody knew. August 1942. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, launched its first major offensive against Japan. Their target was small, just 60 miles long, barely a dot in the Solomon Islands. But the stakes were enormous. Japanese engineers had begun constructing an airfield there, a launch point that could threaten the Allied supply routes to Australia. When U.S. Marines landed on August 7th, they found more jungle than enemy. But within days, Japan struck back. The peaceful lagoon became a graveyard of ships. The skies above Guadalcanal burned night after night. Excerpt Marine Diary. At night the sea glows red. You can't tell if it's flares or the sky itself on fire. 2. The Sea of Death. The battle for Guadalcanal wasn't fought on land alone. It turned the surrounding waters Iron Bottom Sound into one of the most haunted places on Earth. Between August 1942 and February 1943, dozens of warships, American, Japanese, Australian, were sunk in a series of brutal naval clashes. The water ran thick with oil, flames, and the cries of the dying. Japanese sailors called it the Sea of Death. Each night, waves carried wreckage to the shore, helmets, fragments of steel, and bodies. Eyewitness. U.S. Navy signalmen. Every dawn we counted fewer ships. You prayed yours wouldn't be next. The Allies slowly gained the upper hand. Japan's supply convoys, running by night in what became known as the Tokyo Express, couldn't keep up with losses. Starvation and disease hit Japanese troops harder than bullets. 3. Life on the edge. On the island itself, survival became a daily battle. Marines fought not just the enemy, but the jungle, malarial swamps, tropical heat, and endless rain. They nicknamed the place the Green Hell. Food ran short, ammunition ran low, and the bodies of the dead lay unburied under the relentless buzz of FLIs. Letters from soldiers reveal not just fear, but a strange bond between men trapped together in a nightmare that few would ever truly understand. Letter. U.S. Marine. 1942. We live by the sound of planes. When they stop, it feels like the world has ended. But somehow, we still have to eat, dig, and wait. The Japanese, too, endured unimaginable hardship. Cut off from supplies, they resorted to foraging, even eating roots and insects. For them, surrender was unthinkable. Honor demanded death. 4. The turning point. By early 1943, Japan's grip on Guadalcanal had broken. The last survivors slipped away under cover of darkness. After 6 months of unrelenting combat, the island was finally secure. It was the first major Allied victory against Japan, and it shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. But victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly 7,000 Americans and 25,000 Japanese were killed. The Pacific would never be the same. From that point onward, the Allies began their slow, Bloody climb north one island at a time toward Japan itself. 5. Fire and water. The lessons of Guadalcanal echoed through every battle that followed Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each island was a fortress, each one a new inferno. Japan's strategy shifted from conquest to defense, turning every beach, cave, and cliff into a stronghold. For Allied soldiers, it meant advancing through hell, a new kind of warfare where the enemy was unseen until he was only meters away. Excerpt U.S. soldier, Peleliu, you crawl, you throw, you wait. And then the earth opens up and screams at you. The ocean that had once seemed endless now felt like a graveyard of youth. 6. The hidden toll for those who survived the island battles. The scars were not just physical. They carried the sounds, the smells, the images forever. Jungles that whispered in the night. Friends who vanished into fire and sea. The Pacific was vast, but the human experience of it was painfully small, measured in foxholes, canteens, and last letters home. Many who fought there would later say the same words. I left part of myself on that island. Guadalcanal was only the beginning. Across the vast Pacific, Japan still held hundreds of islands, and the war was far from over. Next, we journey to the campaigns that stretched Japan's empire to its breaking point, from New Guinea's jungles to the African front few remember today. If the battles of Guadalcanal opened your eyes to the human cost of the Pacific War, don't miss part for Empire at the Edge, New Guinea, Africa, and the Fading Sun. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the next forgotten front. Empire at the Edge, New Guinea, Africa, and the Fading Sun. By 1943, the Empire of Japan stretched across half the world, from the icy Aleutians to the jungles of Burma, from the coral reefs of Micronesia to the mountains of New Guinea. But every empire has its limit, and as the Allies struck back, Japan's dream of domination began to fracture, not in Tokyo, but on distant, forgotten frontiers. 1. The fight for New Guinea. The island of New Guinea, vast, swampy, and deadly, became the next crucible of the Pacific War. For Japan, it was a shield for their conquests. For the Allies, it was the doorway to reclaiming the Pacific. When Japanese forces landed in 1942, they quickly seized key positions along the northern coast. But to reach Port Moresby, the Allied stronghold, they would have to cross the treacherous Owen Stanley Range, a mountainous jungle where rain fell in torrents and trails vanished into mist. Excerpt Australian soldier's diary. You don't walk here, you crawl. Every step is mud, leeches, and pain. The jungle breeds, and it's against you. The battle along the Kokoda Track became a test of human endurance. Australian and Papuan troops, vastly outnumbered, fought in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Every ridge, every ravine, was contested with unimaginable ferocity. By late 1942, the Japanese advance faltered, crushed not only by the defenders but by starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Those who survived limped back through the jungle, leaving behind thousands of dead in shallow, rain-soaked graves. 2. The shadow of hunger. Across the Pacific front, Japan's armies faced a new enemy supply. Their vast empire stretched too far, the ocean routes too exposed. American submarines prowled the seas, cutting Japan's lifelines thread by thread. In New Guinea, soldiers starved in their foxholes. Rations ran out. Malaria swept through camps like wildfire. Some units resorted to eating roots, rats, even their own pack animals. Excerpt captured Japanese soldier. Interrogation report. We had no food for 10 days. I could not think. I only remember rain and the sound of planes. The Japanese High Command called such suffering spiritual endurance, but spirit alone could not feed an empire. 3. Africa, the forgotten connection. Far from the Pacific, the war in Africa raged between Axis and Allied powers. Here, Japan's role was indirect yet significant. In the deserts of North Africa, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, waged war against the British Eighth Army. Japan and Germany, bound by the Tripartite Pact, shared intelligence, technology, and strategy. Japanese naval attaches operated in Europe and Africa, while German U-boats carried envoys and secret materials through dangerous waters. Axis propaganda spoke of a united front. Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo striking from 3 continents. In practice, their cooperation was strained by distance, mistrust, and differing goals. But the illusion of global unity gave Japan prestige and, for a time, the sense of being unstoppable. Yet for the African colonies under Allied rule, it meant something else entirely. The mobilization of millions of colonial soldiers, men who fought and died far from home, often forgotten by history. 4. The cracks in the empire. By late 1943, the cracks in Japan's empire had become visible. The defeat at Guadalcanal, the stalemate in Burma, the withering campaigns in New Guinea, each front drained resources and morale. Back in Japan, rationing grew severe, factories struggled to replace losses, and the myth of invincibility began to crumble, even within the Japanese army. Divisions emerged between hardliners who demanded death before dishonor, and realists who saw the end approaching. Excerpt: Japanese officers' letter censored. 1944. We are told to die beautifully, but there is nothing beautiful here, only mud and the ghosts of the hungry. 5. The empire's overreach. Japan's empire had grown too vast to govern, too fragile to hold. The same ambition that had driven its expansion now became its undoing. In occupied territories from China to Indonesia, resistance movements grew bolder. Local populations, once promised Asia for ages, now saw Japan as just another conqueror. The co-prosperity sphere, once portrayed as liberation, turned into exploitation. Forced labor, famine, and brutality eroded whatever goodwill Japan had sought. Eyewitness, Indonesian civilian. They said we were brothers, but a brother does not take your rice and beat your father. 6. The fading sun. As 1944 dawned, the rising sun began to dim. The Allies had reclaimed the Solomons and much of New Guinea. The Mariana Islands were under siege. American bombers now struck Japan itself. The once proud empire found itself trapped, surrounded by enemies. Cut off from the world, its armies stranded across half the Pacific with no way home. Yet even as defeat loomed, Japanese soldiers continued to fight with fanatical resolve. For them, surrender meant shame, death, redemption. The empire was dying, but it refused to die quietly. The Pacific had turned against Japan, and soon its enemies would close in from every direction: the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But in the ruins of empire, another story was unfolding of the occupied, the enslaved, and the defiant. If the fading sun of Japan's empire has drawn you in, don't miss Part 5: Occupied Shadows, Resistance, Rebellion, and Survival Under Japanese Rule. Subscribe and join us as we uncover the voices that fought and suffered behind the front lines. Occupied Shadows, Resistance, Rebellion, and Survival Under Japanese Rule. As Japan's armies swept across Asia and the Pacific, their empires seemed unstoppable. From the coasts of China to the jungles of Malaya, from the rice fields of Burma to the islands of Indonesia, the rising sun flew over more than 100 million people. But beneath that sun, there were shadows of fear, hunger, and quiet defiance. This is the story of those who lived under occupation, the ones who resisted, and the millions who endured the weight of an empire built on silence and control. 1. The empire of control. Everywhere Japan advanced, its soldiers brought the same message: Asia for Asians. They promised liberation from Western colonial rule, an end to the European empires that had long divided the continent. For a time, many believed them. In Indonesia, Malaya, Burma, and the Philippines, people cheered Japanese forces as liberators, waving flags, chanting slogans, hoping that at last independence had come. But the illusion shattered quickly. Behind the propaganda lay a regime of forced labor, censorship, and military domination. Local populations were stripped of food and resources to feed Japan's war machine. Dissent was punished with imprisonment or execution. Eyewitness, Burmese villager. 1943. At first, they gave us rice. Then they took it back. They said it was for the emperor. We learned not to ask questions. 2. The reign of fear. The occupation was not uniform, but the fear was. In China, the Kempite, Japan's secret military police, ruled through terror. They arrested anyone suspected of aiding resistance fighters. Torture chambers operated in every major city. In Southeast Asia, the Japanese imposed strict rationing and labor conscription. Millions were forced into building roads, airfields, and railways, including the infamous Burma-Thailand Death Railway. Diary of a Thai Laborer. 1943. We carried stones until our hands bled. Men fell and did not rise again. They buried them beside the tracks. Under the sound of hammers, over 100,000 laborers and prisoners of war died on that railway alone, a monument to human endurance and to cruelty. 3. Voices of resistance. Despite the brutality, resistance grew. Across the occupied lands, secret networks formed, guerrilla armies, underground newspapers, and rebel leaders who risked everything to fight back. In the Philippines, resistance fighters known as the Hukbalahap waged guerrilla war in the mountains, ambushing Japanese patrols and rescuing prisoners. In Burma, Aung San, a nationalist leader once aligned with Japan, turned against his former allies, joining the British to liberate his country. And in China, communist and nationalist forces, bitter rivals, temporarily united to resist the invader. From the ashes of burned villages, new movements were born, movements that would later shape Asia's future long after the war ended. Excerpt message from the Filipino underground. 1944. Where are the ghosts in the jungle? We strike when they least expect it. For every village they burn, we will rise again. 4. The women of war. Amid the chaos, women bore a unique and terrible burden. Thousands were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military, euphemistically called comfort women. They came from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, even Japan's own colonies. Most were teenagers. Many never returned home. Excerpt survivor testimony. Korean woman. 1992. They said it was work. Then the doors locked. For years I forgot my name. These crimes were long buried by shame and silence. But decades later, the survivors would speak, demanding not revenge, but remembrance. 5. Collaboration and betrayal. Occupation blurred the lines between loyalty and survival. Some local leaders collaborated with the Japanese, hoping to secure autonomy or protect their people. Others joined puppet governments, believing that cooperation was the only way to preserve life. In Indonesia, the Japanese allowed nationalist symbols and slogans to flourish, even arming youth groups that would later lead the struggle for independence. But in China, collaboration meant something darker. The puppet regime of Wang Jingwei became synonymous with betrayal, a government that ruled under the shadow of Tokyo's bayonets. Across Asia, families were torn apart not just by war, but by the question of who had chosen the right side. 6. The price of liberation. When the Allied forces returned to Burma, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands, liberation came at a staggering cost. Cities were bombed to rubble, millions were displaced, and the line between liberator and destroyer blurred once more. In Manila, one of Asia's most beautiful cities, the Japanese fought to the last man. By the time the city was taken in 1945, more than 100,000 civilians lay dead, victims of crossfire, massacres, and relentless shelling. The people of Asia had waited years for freedom, but when it came drenched in blood. For those who lived under the rising sun, the scars ran deep. Empires rose and fell, but the memories of loss, resistance, and survival endured. In the next chapter, Japan's empire begins to collapse completely, from the ashes of its occupied lands to the burning skies above its own cities. If the stories of resistance and survival moved you, don't miss Part 6, Fire from the Sky, the Fall of Japan and the Burning Homeland. Subscribe and continue this journey through the final tragic phase of the war. Fire from the Sky, the Fall of Japan and the Burning Homeland. By 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing. Its armies, once unstoppable, were now trapped, starved on distant islands, cut off by Allied fleets, and hunted from the air. But the final chapter of the war would not unfold on the battlefields of China or the jungles of Burma. It would come home to the crowded cities of Japan itself. For the first time in its history, the Japanese homeland would feel the full fury of modern war. And as the bombs began to fall, a nation built on loyalty and sacrifice faced its greatest trial, the question of survival. 1. The empire under siege. By late 1944, Japan was encircled. The Pacific Fleet lay shattered, its merchant ships sunk beneath the waves. Famine and disease spread through the occupied territories. Fuel was almost gone, and yet, surrender was unthinkable. The government's propaganda still spoke of divine victory, of the emperor's eternal spirit. Every man, woman, and child was told they must fight even to the last breath. In the air, a new kind of war was beginning. The B-29 superfortresses, flying from captured islands, carried destruction on a scale never before imagined. Their targets were not just military bases but cities, too. The fire raids began on the night of March 9, 1945. Hundreds of B-29 bombers appeared over Tokyo. Their bomb bays opened and the city below became an inferno. Incendiary bombs filled with jellied gasoline fell by the thousands. Wooden houses, crammed together in narrow streets, ignited instantly. The flames leapt from block to block, consuming everything. Eyewitness account Tokyo survivor. The heat was like a living thing. The air itself caught fire. I saw mothers clutching babies, running into the river, but the water boiled. By dawn, 100,000 people were dead, and a quarter of Tokyo lay in ashes. It was the single deadliest night of the war, and Tokyo was only the beginning. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, over 60 cities would burn before summer's end. 3. Life amid the ruins. In the charred ruins of Japan's cities, survival became an act of will. Families lived in makeshift shelters built from scorched tin and scrap wood. Food was scarce, medicine rarer still. Children searched for rice in the ashes. Diary Osaka schoolgirl. June 1945. We sleep under the open sky now. Every night we watch the bombers passing. The grown-ups say we are safe here, but the sky never sleeps. Censorship and fear silence dissent. But rumors spread that even the gods had abandoned Japan. The people no longer feared invasion. They feared starvation. 4. The kamikaze creed in desperation. Japan turned to the most tragic weapon of all, its own sons. Thousands of young pilots volunteered or were ordered to become kamikaze. Divine wind. Their mission was simple: to crash their aircraft into Allied ships. They were told they would die heroes, defending the emperor. But many were just boys barely trained, writing farewell letters before their final flight. Excerpt: Kamikaze pilot letter. 1945. Mother, do not weep. I fly now to protect the homeland. When the cherry blossoms fall, think of me. It was a ritualized death, born of despair and duty. More than 3,800 pilots died in these missions. They sank dozens of ships but could not stop the tide. 5. The invasion that never came. The Allies prepared for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. It would have been the largest amphibious assault in history, an army of millions landing on Kyushu and Honshu. Estimates predicted up to 2 million Japanese casualties and nearly 1 million Allied dead. The Japanese military vowed to arm civilians with bamboo spears and Molotov cocktails. Every school child was to become a soldier, every town a fortress. But that invasion never came, because, before it could begin, a new weapon would change everything. 6. Hiroshima. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American bomber, the Enola Gay, approached the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomb fell, a blinding flash. A wave of heat hot enough to melt steel. A city of 350,000 gone in seconds. Eyewitness: Hiroshima doctor. I looked up and saw a blue-white light. The next moment, the hospital was gone. People were walking without skin. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more burned, blinded, poisoned by radiation. 7. Nagasaki and the emperor's surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The city vanished under a mushroom cloud. That same day, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing the last remnants of Japan's army in the north. At last, even the most loyal generals understood the war was lost. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio, the first time they had ever heard his voice. His words were veiled in formality, but the meaning was clear. Japan would surrender. Excerpt: Imperial broadcast. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. Across the country, people wept, some in relief, some in disbelief, and some in shame. 8. Ashes and aftermath. In the days that followed, silence settled over the ruins of Japan. The once mighty empire lay in dust, its cities destroyed, its army broken, its people starving. Millions returned from the colony's soldiers, laborers and civilians to a homeland they could barely recognize. Entire families had vanished, generations lost. Survivor, Tokyo. 1946. When I looked at the skyline, I could see from one end of the city to the other. There were no buildings to block the view, only smoke. Yet from that devastation, something remarkable would rise, a nation that would rebuild, reimagine, and redefine itself. But that story belongs to another time. For now, we stand amid the ashes where the fire from the sky marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The war that began with ambition ended in annihilation. The rising sun had fallen, but its shadow would stretch far into the post-war age. If this episode moved you, don't miss Part 7, Aftermath, Trials, Occupation, and the Birth of a New Japan. Subscribe and continue this powerful journey through the echoes of World War II. Aftermath, Trials, Occupation, and the Birth of a New Japan. The guns had fallen silent. The smoke had lifted, but the peace that followed Japan's surrender was not gentle. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with everything the war had destroyed, and everything it had revealed. The rising sun had set. Now, in its shadow, a new dawn would have to be built. 1. The day after August 1945. For the first time in centuries, foreign troops occupied Japanese soil. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, landed at Otsugi Air Base, stepping into a nation shattered beyond recognition. Cities were gone. Industry was rubble. Millions were homeless. Food production had collapsed. Famine loomed. Diary, Tokyo civil servant. Sept 1945. People lined the roads for miles, faces thin and gray. We traded kimonos for rice, wedding rings for potatoes. It was as if the country had stopped breathing. For many Japanese, the occupation felt like walking in a dream, a world without the old gods, without the emperor's divinity, and without certainty of tomorrow. 2. The occupation begins. The occupation of Japan was unlike anything the world had seen. MacArthur ruled not as a conqueror but as an architect tasked with rebuilding a nation from its ashes. The first order was disarmament. Soldiers surrendered rifles, swords, and even family heirlooms. The once mighty imperial army was dissolved overnight. Next came democratization. Censorship was lifted. Political prisoners were freed. Women were granted the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. And, in a move both symbolic and seismic, the emperor himself renounced his divine status. Excerpt Emperor Hirohito. New Year's Day 1946. The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. The idea that the emperor is divine is a false conception. The voice that had once commanded armies now spoke as a man among men. 3. The war crimes trials. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another form of justice was unfolding. In Tokyo's war-torn government buildings, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened Japan's version of Nuremberg. 28 of the empire's most powerful leaders stood accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Among them were generals, ministers, and intellectuals who had steered Japan's imperial destiny. They faced charges for atrocities committed from Nanjing to Manila. From Burma to the Pacific, the trial lasted over 2 years, filling 50,000 pages of testimony. Excerpt prosecutor's statement. 1946. This war was not a thunderbolt from heaven. It was planned, nurtured, and unleashed by men who sought power without conscience. 7 were sentenced to death. Others received life imprisonment. The emperor was spared, a decision that remains debated to this day. 4. The struggle to survive for ordinary people. The trials were distant echoes. Their daily battle was for survival. The black markets thrived. Food rations barely sustained the living. Families bartered heirlooms for bread or searched ruins for scrap metal to sell. Women, widowed by war, became heads of households overnight. Children scavenged through rubble, their uniforms replaced with rags. Yet, amid the devastation, something remarkable began to stir: a resilience, a will to rebuild that defied despair. Letter Osaka factory worker, 1947. We have nothing left, but the air feels different now. There are no soldiers shouting, no flags in the wind. Only work and the promise that maybe, if we keep working, we'll find ourselves again. 5. A new constitution in 1947. Japan adopted a new constitution written largely by American lawyers, but shaped by Japanese ideals. It transformed the nation overnight. Article 9 declared, aspiring sincerely to an international peace, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. The country that had once built an empire by the sword now swore never again to raise it. Power shifted from the emperor to the people. Elections, civil rights, and education reforms redefined society. And for the first time, Japan's future would be written not by generals, but by civilians. 6. The transformation of a nation. The late 1940s brought both hardship and rebirth. American aid poured in. Factories reopened. Schools were rebuilt. MacArthur's administration launched sweeping land reforms, breaking up vast estates and giving farmland to millions of tenant farmers. It was a quiet revolution, and through it all, Japanese ingenuity returned. Young engineers who had once built planes and tanks now built radios, sewing machines, and bicycles. The seeds of Japan's future economic miracle were being planted in its ruins. Excerpt U.S. Occupation Report. 1948. No people in history have rebuilt with such discipline and grace under humiliation. Their spirit is unbroken. 7. Memory, guilt, and reconciliation. But rebuilding the body was easier than rebuilding the soul. Across Japan, silence surrounded the memories of the war. The veterans rarely spoke. The teachers rarely taught. Entire generations grew up unsure whether their fathers had been heroes or villains. Some carried guilt for the atrocities in Asia, for the blind obedience that led to ruin. Others clung to nostalgia for a time when Japan's flag had commanded fear and respect. And yet, through this tension, a quiet reconciliation began. War memorials rose, not in triumph, but in mourning. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began to question what the empire had truly cost. The dialogue that would define post-war Japan had begun. How do you remember a war you were taught not to question? 8. The birth of a new Japan. By the early 1950s, the occupation was drawing to a close. Japan had changed beyond recognition. In 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco officially ended the state of war and restored Japan's sovereignty. The American troops remained as allies, not occupiers. And in 1952, as the flags were lowered, a nation stood once more, no longer an empire, but a democracy. The people who had once fought under the rising sun now lived under a new banner of peace and progress. They had endured defeat, humiliation, and hunger, but from those ashes rose something stronger than empire. Understanding. The war that had sought to conquer the world had, instead, remade Japan's soul. In a single decade, Japan journeyed from destruction to rebirth, a living testament that peace, though fragile, can rise even from the darkest ruins of war. If you followed Japan's journey from empire to ashes, don't miss our final episode, Echoes of War, the world Japan left behind. Subscribe and join us as we explore how the legacy of these forgotten battles still shapes our world today. Echoes of War, the world Japan left behind. The war ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was memory, heavy, complex, inescapable. Across Asia and the Pacific, the ghosts of Japan's empire lingered in the ruins and the stories. And in the generations born long after the fighting had stopped, this is the story of what came after. The story of the echoes, the unseen war that would never truly end. 1. The scars across Asia. When Japan surrendered in 1945, its empire crumbled overnight. From China to Burma, from Korea to Indonesia, millions were suddenly free and yet unprepared for what freedom would cost. In China, Entire cities lay in ruin. Millions were dead. Civil wars soon reignited between nationalists and communists, fueled by the power vacuum Japan left behind. In Korea, liberation turned into division north and south, split by ideology and foreign influence. In Indonesia and Vietnam, Japanese occupation had awakened nationalist movements that would soon fight their own colonial wars. The empire was gone, but the shock waves of its fall reshaped the modern world. 2. The price of victory. The Allied victory in the Pacific came at an unimaginable cost. In Asia alone, over 30 million civilians had died from famine, forced labor, massacres, and bombings. Entire generations disappeared. In places like Nanjing, Manila, and Singapore, the scars ran deep and spoken, but never forgotten. For many survivors, justice never came. The Tokyo trials condemned a handful of leaders, but countless crimes went unpunished. Memories became political, history became contested, and the question of guilt, who bore it and who denied it, would haunt Asia for decades. Eyewitness. Nanjing survivor. We thought the war ended, but the memories never did. The soldiers left, but they live inside our dreams. 3. The Cold War's shadow. As Japan rebuilt, the world changed again. The flames of World War II gave way to the frost of the Cold War. The U.S. and its former enemies now stood side by side against a new threat: communism. Japan, stripped of its army, became America's anchor in the Pacific. Bases remained, treaties were signed, and the island nation that once sought to dominate Asia now became its industrial engine. By the 1960s, Japan was reborn, the world's second-largest economy, exporting cars, cameras, and culture across the globe. But beneath the neon lights of post-war prosperity, the shadows of the past remained. Excerpt: Japanese historian 1982. We rebuilt our cities, but not our memories. We replaced guilt with growth. 4. The memory wars. Across the decades, Japan's wartime memory became a battleground of its own. Schoolbooks softened the stories. Monuments honored the fallen, but not always the victims. And every few years, old wounds reopened: a visit to a shrine, a denial of a massacre, a dispute over an island. For the victims across Asia, remembrance was survival. For Japan, it was reconciliation. And for historians, it was a fight against forgetting. The war was no longer just history, it was identity. How nations remembered it determined who they believed themselves to be. Excerpt: South Korean teacher. Our students ask, why do they not remember what they did to us? And I have no answer, only silence. 5. The human legacy beyond politics and textbooks. The war's legacy lived in the hearts of those who had seen it. Elderly women in Korea still spoke of the years they were forced into sexual slavery as comfort women. In the Pacific Islands, rusted tanks lay buried under vines, children playing in their shadows. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors the Hibakusha carried invisible scars, their lives marked by radiation and rejection. Testimony: Hiroshima survivor 1970. When I close my eyes, I still see the light. It burned the world into my memory, yet many of them turned their pain into purpose, speaking in schools, writing books, standing before cameras so that the world would not forget what war truly meant. 6. The lessons of the Pacific. Historians often call the Pacific War the most brutal theater of World War II, a war of annihilation, fueled by race, pride, and empire. But from that darkness came lessons that shaped the future. That war without mercy only breeds more hatred. That victory without compassion is hollow. And that peace must be built, not declared. Japan learned those lessons the hard way. Its post-war constitution became a testament to them. A nation that once glorified death now embraced peace as its highest ideal. The irony was profound but also hopeful. 7. Echoes in the modern world today. The echoes of those forgotten battles still reach us. In the jungles of Burma, unexploded bombs still surface after monsoon rains. In the Solomon Islands, fishermen still catch relics in their nets. And in the skies over Hiroshima each August, doves still rise where fire once fell. Around the Pacific, museums, memorials, and graves tell fragments of the same story, not of victory or defeat, but of endurance. The soldiers who fought on those distant islands are almost gone now, but their letters remain. Their faces, captured in fading photographs, look out from history with the same silent question: was it worth it? 8. The final reflection: from the deserts of Africa to the jungles of Burma, from the ruins of Tokyo to the beaches of Guadalcanal, the story of Japan in World War II is more than a chronicle of battles. It is the story of humanity, of ambition, destruction, and the painful path to redemption. Empires rose and fell. Nations bled and healed. But the echoes of that war remain in the way we speak, the alliances we form, and the memories we pass down. History is not only what happened. It is what we choose to remember and what we dare to learn. This was the end of Japan's war and the beginning of the world we live in now. If this documentary moved you, remember to subscribe and share it to keep these forgotten stories alive. From the jungles of Asia to the ashes of Japan, the lessons of the past still speak today. Because remembering is the first step to never repeating.